In this video, we will be looking at the 2008 presidential election as part of our presidential election series. I've decided to do this election in 3 parts, and here is why. We will see in 2008 competitive primaries in both major parties, and really to this extent, we have not seen that in the prior elections we've looked at. Yes, in 1992, Pat Buchanan challenged George H.W. Bush and was somewhat competitive, but Bush ended up sweeping the primary, so it wasn't that competitive. Similar thing happened in 2000 with Al Gore and Bill Bradley. But in 2008, there will be no sweeping. In fact, the candidate that would be ahead in the polls for most of the year prior will not win the nomination of either party. So both primaries this year in 2008 are going to be quite interesting. I'll cover the Democratic primary in part 2 and the general election in part 3. A lot of people remember the drama of the Democratic nomination battle, but the Republican primary battle also had plenty of intrigue. It was a transitional moment for the party, probably the last year that the religious right had significant influence in the primary. So let's take a look at this election, and as usual, we will start off with a brief bit of information about what was going on at the time and the context, the historical context of the election. So we're going to see George W. Bush in his second term, and while he did win a second term, he had his share of opposition. His unpopularity was increasing, and opposition to him was mounting. So his approval rating is going to continue to decline, which is going to make it hard for any Republican to face the voters in 2008 and try to win them over. So the main factor causing Bush's popularity decline was the war in Iraq. Casualties were mounting and the goals were taking long to achieve. There was a civil war raging in the country and power was fragmented. There were many factions in Iraq that were opposed to the U.S., including some that were supported by the Iranian regime and some that were supported by al-Qaeda. U.S. allies there in Iraq did not have the full support of the Iraqi people and did not have the ability to control the country without the U.S. support. When Bush first discussed going to the war and he first was trying to sell it to the American people, he did not give the American people reason to believe that it would be so difficult and it would take so long. So a lot of people were frustrated with his administration, and that was a main factor in the decline in his popularity. Another factor was a hurricane that occurred called Hurricane Katrina, and this would really hit the Gulf Coast and do tremendous damage. It showcased 2 concerns. One was that the levees that were meant to protect New Orleans from floods had not been properly maintained, and the levees had broken, and the massive flooding that occurred in New Orleans really ravaged the city. The government response to it, too, was far from ideal, and at first Bush had praised FEMA Director Brown for the job he did, but when it became apparent that the rescue and cleanup efforts were riddled with problems, Bush would end up firing Brown. But the damage had been done to Bush's reputation, and that further caused his popularity to decline. The Democrats will see big gains in the 2006 midterms, and the Republicans will see big losses. Let's start by looking at the Senate. Democrats are going to win 5 seats in 2006, and this kind of goes to show you what happens in a wave election. You see candidates winning in states where their party normally doesn't perform that well in, but in a wave election, you see that happening where sometimes you see some upsets. You also see longtime incumbents lose their seats. They had won in prior years, but when there's a wave election, sometimes they don't win. So let's look at Montana, where we see an example of both. Montana had been a state where Bush had carried it twice, and we see the incumbent was Conrad Burns, who had been elected 3 times. So he was going for his fourth election here, his 4th term, but he's going to end up losing to Democratic candidate John Tester that year. So we see Burns. Now Burns didn't necessarily always win in landslides, but he did win 3 times. And Montana, like I said, had been a Republican state, but here we see the Democrats winning the seat there. And then we do also see Virginia, and that also had been a state Bush had carried twice, and the incumbent was George Allen. George Allen had been a governor before being the senator, but he's going to end up losing his seat to Jim Webb. Now, a lot of that had to do with a big gaffe that George Allen made during one of his speeches, but also that Jim Webb was a pretty strong candidate that the Democrats had nominated, and it just was a Democratic year. And we'd also see in Missouri, there had been a seat there where it had a lot of drama in recent elections, and this year would be no exception. We're going to see the Democrat Claire McCaskill win a nail-biter election against incumbent Jim Talent. Again, Missouri, another state that Bush had carried twice. Also, Ohio had been a state that Bush had carried twice, and we see the moderate incumbent Mike DeWine would lose the seat to Sherrod Brown. We would also see in Pennsylvania, Bob Casey Jr. would end up winning that seat against Rick Santorum, the incumbent senator, who had won a couple of terms. And in Rhode Island, Rhode Island had a seat represented by a Republican, Chafee, for many decades, even though it had been going Democrat in presidential years. But this year, Lincoln Chafee would lose his bid for re-election, and he would be out. So the other state where there was some intrigue was Connecticut. Now, Joe Lieberman would win re-election, but he'd have to do some hurdle jumping of his own. Remember, Joe Lieberman had been the running mate of Al Gore in the 2000 election. He had run for president in his own right in 2004, but when he attempted to run for re-election in 2006, he was challenged in the Democratic primary by the more dovish Ned Lamont. Now, remember, Joe Lieberman was hawkish. He had supported the Iraq War, and he continued to support the war effort. So the Democrats nominated a different person. So Lieberman had to run as an independent, but he did end up winning the re-election and would caucus with the Democrats and still continue to vote for them most of the time. But he was rather embittered from that experience. And in the House, we would see the Democrats pick up 31 seats, and this would make Nancy Pelosi Speaker and oust Dennis Hastert, who would no longer be Speaker after this. So we would see Democrats doing particularly well in the Northeast. We're going to see both New Hampshire seats moving to the Democratic column, as well as 2 seats in Connecticut, including the one that had been held by longtime incumbent Nancy Johnson. We're also going to see 3 seats in upstate New York, 4 in Pennsylvania, go Democratic as well. So a lot is often talked about how the Republicans managed to start doing better and better in congressional elections during the 90s and early 2000s in the South. But there was a flip to that, and that was during this election, where we see the Democrats countering that by winning over a lot of former Republican strongholds in the North. And also, besides the Northeast, also in some of the North Central, the Great Lakes area, we would see the Democrats picking up several seats in that geographic area as well. So with Bush's popularity down, the Republican brand was really suffering, and the conventional wisdom was that if Republicans were going to have a chance in 2008, they needed to break with George W. Bush and not nominate anybody from the Bush orbit. So Vice President Cheney, for example, would not run in 2008 for president, nor would the president's brother Jeb, who had been governor of Florida at that time. And same thing with the Secretaries of State Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice. Neither of them will run either, as the Republicans are going to look for basically a non-Bushite to represent them in 2008. So let's look at the candidates who did run, and let's try to evaluate their strengths and weaknesses, who they might have appealed to, who they might have not appealed to. They had to walk a fine line. Most of them did not outright go after Bush, although there would be kind of one exception that kind of would. But for the most part, none of them really went after him, but none of them really embraced him either. Nobody wanted to be considered a Bush guy, and yet they generally did not want to go too far in their critiques of the administration. Let's start with Mitt Romney. Mitt Romney was the son of former Michigan Governor George Romney, who himself had run for president in 1968. Romney was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ and Latter-day Saints, often referred to as the Mormon Church. Romney was active in the church and had served as a local leader during different points in his life. He had also been a businessman and first came into the political spotlight when he ran against Ted Kennedy for the Massachusetts Senate seat in 1994. Romney would end up losing that election, but after that, he would play an important leadership role in the 1998 Winter Olympics and would win significant acclaim for the job he did in doing so. He would then go back to Massachusetts and run for governor. This time he would win the governorship of that state. Now, as a Mormon leader, Romney had taken conservative positions, but as a Massachusetts politician, he had sometimes taken liberal positions. For example, when he ran against Kennedy, he said that he was for legal abortion. But now in 2008, when he's running for the Republican nomination, he was saying that he was against legal abortion. And this gave many social conservatives concerns about him. They weren't sure where his heart was at, and he had a reputation of being something of a flip-flopper. And that was something that had also plagued John Kerry 4 years earlier, another Massachusetts politician. So as governor, Mitt Romney had passed a healthcare reform measure, but a lot of conservatives were uneasy with that measure, kind of seeing it as government overreach. But conservatives did appreciate his business credentials, and he got his campaign off to an early start. He traveled the country a lot in 2006, giving speeches on behalf of different candidates that were running in the midterms, and that helped with his networking and helped him to win many endorsements. So he would be very organized and well funded during his campaign. And I think that his business background kind of helped him with that. But he also had significant enthusiasm from his fellow Mormons, and they would donate to him, they would volunteer for him, and show him strong support and turn out for him in large numbers. And I think that that would help his campaign tremendously moving forward. If social conservatives had reservations about Romney, they had no such reservations about Sam Brownback, who was a senator from Kansas at this time. He had been a social conservative stalwart and hoped to win over like-minded voters who had been strongly represented in past Republican primaries and a big part of George W. Bush's base. But Brownback would not be the only one looking to win over those voters. And I think it could be said that Brownback maybe lacked the charisma to be successful in a competitive field in the television age, and he never really was able to gain too much traction in his campaign. Thompson would be a case study in what can happen when a candidate misses his moment. Thompson had been a superstar in the Republican Party in the 1990s. He had been elected governor in a Democratic-leaning state of Wisconsin and passed comprehensive welfare reform, which was something the Republicans loved at that time. He had been talked about as a potential presidential candidate in 1996 and 2000, but never went for it during those years. By 2008, he decided to give it a go, but his star had faded by that point. Welfare reform, his signature issue, is no longer on the front pages, and he came across as a candidate from a different era. His campaign would not gain much traction, and he would quietly drop out before the first contests. If Sam Brownback thought he was going to win over social conservatives without competition, he would need to think again. Mike Huckebee had been governor of Arkansas and a Baptist minister prior to that, so he was a true blue member of the evangelical community. Huckebee had a kind of softer edge to his demeanor and often showcased a sense of humor and humility rare in a politician. The likability factor certainly benefited him, but many conservatives would criticize him for not being conservative enough on some social issues like immigration and state spending in Arkansas. Huckabee had the potential to do well in southern and prairie states, but started out as one of the lesser known candidates. For whatever reason, House members seem to struggle in presidential elections, and we've seen several House members run and underperform in the elections we have looked at in past videos. Tom Tancredo is going to try to buck that trend here in 2008. His signature issue during that time would be immigration, an issue that was becoming more and more prominent amongst the Republican base. He was a representative from Colorado and had a strong conservative voting record, particularly on social issues. So he had the right issue formula, to maybe gain some traction in this election. So John McCain had run for president in 2000, of course, and we had talked about him when we did their video on that race. And he had won several primaries that year and kind of became a breakout star, even though he wouldn't get the Republican nomination that year. So things had gotten pretty heated between him and Bush in 2000. And then during the early part of the Bush administration, McCain would continue to have a rather cold relationship with the president. He had opposed him on certain issues in kind of rather high-profile ways. But things would slowly improve as McCain stuck his neck out to be supportive of the Iraq War, even as the popularity of the war had waned. So McCain would also help Bush pass a moderate kind of immigration reform measure, but this was disliked by many social conservatives, and that would be something that he would continue to get flack for throughout this primary. In 2000, McCain had been critical of some of the religious right leaders, but he generally had a conservative voting record on their issues. And of course, as we had said in 2000, McCain had a very good relationship with the media, and because of his run that year, he had more name recognition than some of the other candidates, so he had that going for him as well. Another candidate with significant name recognition would be Rudolph Giuliani. He had been mayor of New York and was highly praised for bringing crime down in that city and was especially respected by conservatives for doing so. He was also mayor during the September 11th attacks and won critical acclaim for his handling of that situation. His name recognition, like I said, was rather high and his early poll numbers would be strong, but he had some liberal positions, particularly on social issues that, made a lot of Republican primary voters uneasy. He had favored legal abortion and continued to do so. He had also been for gay rights and he had been for gun control. And in 1994, he had endorsed Democratic candidate Mario Cuomo for the governor's race in New York. So a lot of conservatives, especially social conservatives, were uneasy with him due to these positions. Ron Paul was kind of straddled between the Republican and Libertarian parties. He was first elected to the House as a Republican in Texas, but then he left the House and ran for president as the Libertarian nominee in 1988. He then went back to the House and back to the Republican Party again. So his positions were more Republican than most Libertarians, especially the Libertarian presidential candidates that we've looked at so far. Ron Paul tends to be a little bit more conservative and Republican leaning than they are, but compared to most Republicans, he's more libertarian leaning. So within the Libertarian Party, there is something called the Mises wing, which tends to be a little bit more conservative than the sort of mainline libertarians. So that wing of the party tends to be very supportive of Ron Paul's ideas to this day, but at different points in time, they have not been the dominant faction within the Libertarian Party. But as far as the Republican Party goes, he would be the one candidate in this field that would speak out against the Iraq War and the Afghan War as well. And he would, really be the only candidate in this field unequivocally doing so. He's also going to be against measures like the Patriot Act, which sought to crack down on domestic terrorism, but many libertarians felt the act infringed too much on civil liberties. So he certainly took that position as well. He was also, a staunch economics guy, and he was for deficit reduction and fiscal responsibility. So he made those things major themes of his campaign, and he also advocated for drug legalization, making him the only candidate in this field to take that position. Duncan Hunter was a member of the House from California, and his focus was mainly on military affairs. He had been a veteran and a member of the Armed Services Committee. He represented a part of California, San Diego County, that had a strong military presence, and he was a staunch conservative, particularly on social issues. Now, this was a time where California had its share of conservatives, and we saw Bob Dornan, another very conservative member of the House that ran in 1996. So Duncan Hunter would be another one. I kind of feel like that faction is no longer present amongst California Republicans. But Duncan Hunter would try to take the mantle of the staunch conservative, but he'd have a hard time breaking out and gaining much traction and wouldn't really get a ton of media attention for his run in this election. On paper, Fred Thompson looked like a formidable candidate. He was a Renaissance man, having practiced law, acting, and politics. Now let's start by talking about his acting. He was in movies such as Hunt for Red October and Die Hard 2, and then he was elected to the Senate in 1994, replacing Al Gore when Al Gore vacated his Tennessee Senate seat to become vice president. So after leaving the Senate, Thompson would return to acting, and he would be on Law and Order and play the DA there, who would be basically, he was McCoy's boss in the show. So we've seen other candidates try to enter the race later and help to benefit from other candidates who maybe enter early, start beating each other up, and maybe peak too early. In 2004, we saw Howard Dean get off to an early and strong start, but maybe peaked a little too early and fizzled by the time the actual voting happened. And there was maybe some concern that Mitt Romney might do that this year as he got off to a strong and early start. So Thompson's going to lay low a little bit and try to hope to have some late momentum that could help him just as the voting starts. And, it seemed like I was saying earlier, a lot of conservatives, particularly social conservatives, had misgivings about Mitt Romney, John McCain, Rudolph Giuliani, and even Mike Huckebee, but they didn't have such misgivings about Fred Thompson. He had been a pretty consistent conservative but he had a higher stature than the likes of Duncan Hunter, Tom Tancredo, and Sam Brownback, having been a member of the Senate, having good media relations, and was much more of a household name than either of those other people who were trying to take on that social conservative mantle. So he seemed to have a pretty good shot at, maybe doing well in this. So let's see how he does. So let's take a look at the calendar. Now, the Republican Party had not wanted to have such a compressed and early primary and caucus process as they had in 2004. They were hoping it could spread out and go later than it had that year. And they partially succeeded in doing so, but not completely. As we can see here, it was still a pretty compressed primary schedule. Some states would end up having to get penalized, and the way they tried to they tried to do this was to say that they would penalize states who would lose delegates if they went too early. And we're going to see Michigan and Florida in particular are going to get penalized and lose half their delegates because they decided to go much earlier than the Republican Party had wanted them to go. So we see, of course, Iowa and New Hampshire going first, and those two contests will happen in less than a week from each other. And then Michigan will go a week later. And then 4 days after that, we're going to see Nevada and South Carolina go the same day. Now Florida is going to go January 29th. Now Super Tuesday is going to be February 5th, and then 20 states are going to go that day. So it's still a pretty compressed schedule, but maybe not as much as it had been in 2004. So let's start by looking at some polls from the late spring and summer. So this first one is going to be a Fox poll, and Giuliani is going to have the lead here at 24%, McCain second at 17%, and then a Rasmussen poll is actually going to show Fred Thompson with a slight lead in mid-June. That was probably right after he announced his exploratory committee. And then later in the summer, we're going to see Gallup do a poll in July, and Giuliani is going to have a lead 30 to 20. Thompson is going to be the one at 20%, and then we're going to see McCain in third with 16%, and then August 1st, Newsweek's going to put out a poll with Giuliani in first with 30%, and Thompson in second with 22%, and McCain in third with 13%. So according to these national numbers, it looks like it's a race between Giuliani and Thompson, with McCain maybe in a little bit of a distant third to the other two. So in July, John McCain's fundraising will be well below expectations, and his poll numbers were kind of middling, as we saw in those earlier numbers in the prior slide. So he's going to execute a staff shakeup, eliminating positions, reducing pay, making paid employees volunteer employees, and then restructuring his campaign to something leaner and more cost effective. And whenever a candidate has to do something like this, it's going to become public knowledge and it's going to hurt their image. And that's certainly going to happen to McCain. And there's going to be a lot of rumbling that maybe it's not a successful campaign and that it won't last. But he's going to, insist that after this shakeup, he's going to move on and do better moving forward. So we're going to see the Ames straw poll happen in the summer. This is going to happen in August, and this is usually an event that happens during a period kind of in between what we might call the early stage of the campaign and in this kind of middle stage where candidates look to kind of show how much support they have, how well organized they are, and the kind of lower and mid-tier candidates use this as a way to kind of boost their image, maybe gain a little bit of momentum, gain a little bit of traction. So a lot of times the candidates, especially those lower and mid-tier candidates, will put a lot into this to hope that it could generate some buzz for them. So what's going to happen is Romney is going to end up pulling out first place in this. As I said earlier, he had a very organized and well-funded operation, and he's going to do well in situations like this. Huckebee is going to come in second, and I think in Iowa, the evangelical community is going to be quite strong, and they're going to really gravitate towards him. Sam Brownback had hoped to win over those voters, but he's going to finish behind Huckebee and only come in third, and he's going to be very disappointed in that. His fundraising had been low at that time, and his poll numbers were low as well, so he really needed something like this to spark things, and the third place finish he didn't think would do so. So he's going to end up dropping out shortly after this straw poll. Tom Tancredo is actually going to come in fourth, and then Ron Paul fifth. And we see here the pictures of these different activists here in the top right. We see this young woman. It's a smile a mile wide. Definitely easy to look at her, but her enthusiasm is not going to help Sam Brownback do any better than that third place finish. And in the top right, we see an Elvis impersonator there supporting Duncan Hunter. And in the bottom left, we see Mitt Romney very happy with his Iowa straw poll result. And then in the bottom right, we see a very enthusiastic Tom Tancredo supporter, expressing his appreciation for his candidate. So Giuliani was ahead in most national polls, but many voters liked his crime policies and his response to the September 11th attacks and his terrorism policies. But on social issues like abortion, gay rights, and gun rights, he was out of step and to the left of conservative activists, especially social conservatives and members of the religious right. And they also had concerns about his personal life and, like I said, his support of Mario Cuomo in 1994. So a lot of these social conservative influencers met to discuss how to stop Giuliani and how to respond to his candidacy. Because as we saw, he was ahead in most of the polls nationally and seemed to be the front runner at this time. But these members of the religious right didn't seem to like that, and they discussed possibly voting third party if he actually ends up winning the nomination. So amongst these folks would be James Dobson, who would be the leader of something called Focus on the Family, and Tony Perkins, who would be the leader of the Family Research Council. So they were staunch anti-Giuliani people. Now, they didn't have a particular candidate that they were behind. I bet they would be perfectly happy with Mike Huckebee. They probably liked Fred Thompson, but they weren't ready to get behind any one person, but they were ready to not be behind Rudolph Giuliani, and they make their motivations known for that purpose. So let's look at some September polls. So we start with some national polls, a USA Today Gallup poll, and we see Giuliani continuing to be in first place and Fred Thompson continuing to be in second place, McCain in third as well. So not too different from the summer polls there as we move into September. And then we see a Pew Research poll, which is going to show something very similar as well. And then in September 21st to the 25th, an AP Ipsos poll is also going to show something very similar, but we see McCain kind of gaining a little bit of ground, but it's still a Giuliani in the lead with Thompson in second and McCain in third, but this time it's not so distant. Now, with this October 1st to the 3rd, we're going to see a Des Moines Register poll. So this will be our first Iowa poll that we're going to look at. So we're going to actually see Mitt Romney ahead there in Iowa. And that's significant because all we've looked at so far are those national polls, and Mitt Romney had very middling kind of numbers. He was generally in fourth place in most of those polls, but here we see in Iowa, Mitt Romney is actually in the lead, and it looks like Fred Thompson is in second. Now, Giuliani, who had been in the lead nationally, was in fourth in Iowa behind Romney, Thompson, and Huckabee. So Giuliani is going to struggle in the early states. And we see New Hampshire on the bottom there from October 2nd, an insider advantage poll from New Hampshire. And we're going to see Romney ahead in that one as well. So he's going to have 27%, and Giuliani is going to be second with 20%. So Giuliani's ahead nationally, but in these first two states that are going to hold contests, we're going to see Romney ahead. Romney's only going to be in fourth place nationally. So it'll be interesting to see, will Romney's momentum, if he wins these early states, propel him to better national numbers, and will Giuliani be able to stay ahead if he's not as successful in those early states? Politicians often get flack for wanting to win too badly, for being desperate and seeming to be willing to do anything just to be more liked. This can sometimes be unappealing to voters. Fred Thompson was trying to buck that trend in this election and hoping that people might find it refreshing. So, one example I'll give was an event that happened at a firehouse. He was given a fireman's hat to put on by somebody, and he refused to wear it. Said that he doesn't wear silly hats. It was awkward because the typical thing for a politician to do would be to put on the silly hat, take the photo in hopes that it could win people over. But Thompson tried a different approach, and he hoped that voters sick of the typical politician might find his approach refreshing. Incidentally, his wife would end up putting the hat on to try to lighten up the situation a bit, but it certainly, made its mark and gave people a certain impression about Thompson. Some thought that Thompson's approach indicated that perhaps he didn't want it that badly. He certainly didn't have as busy a campaign schedule as the other candidates, and I think his attitude was that he didn't want to be desperate. He didn't want to think that winning the presidency was the be all and end all. So he had a little bit more of a laid back demeanor. And Anderson Cooper, in one interview, asked him flat out if he was lazy. Other candidates were certainly putting more hours into their campaigns and engaging in more photo ops, and yes, sometimes putting on silly hats and other such stunts. Now, Thompson was trying to be different and hoped that it would appeal to certain voters who were sick of the typical politics. But, maybe there's something to be said for the typical politics. Well, we'll see how all of this fares and if it will help Thompson in this campaign. So we're going to have several debates, and TV stations would hold online polls afterwards about who would win. And usually Ron Paul won in those surveys, but Giuliani struggled in these debates as he didn't have as much experience on the national stage, and his expertise on national and international issues was not as strong as some of the other candidates. Mike Huckebee, on the other hand, performed well. He had an easygoing demeanor and a sharp wit. The debates helped him to gain traction. I think Fred Thompson saw Huckabee start to gain and potentially saw Huckabee winning a lot of the voters that Thompson appealed to. And so he started to go on the attack, and he went after Huckabee in several debates, criticizing his views on immigration, foreign policy, and fiscal matters. So Ron Paul, as I mentioned earlier, connected a lot with young voters, and that's why I think he won a lot of those online polls. He had a lot of voters that were very connected online. They were very enthusiastic. They found his avuncular and grandfatherly demeanor appealing. I also think his, kind of straight, no-nonsense libertarian message appealed to a lot of young people as well, particularly young males. So he got a lot of support amongst that demographic, and, that might not have been reflected in some of his lower national poll numbers, but he certainly had a lot of enthusiasm behind him in this campaign. Now let's take a look at some more polls. We're going to start with a national poll from mid-October, and we see Giuliani still in the lead. He's got 29%, and Thompson is in second with 21%. McCain not far behind him in this poll with 18%. Then we see a New Hampshire poll from mid-October as well, also from CNN and WMUR, and we see here actually Romney in the lead. So in the national poll taken in mid-October, Romney is actually in fourth place, but he's first in New Hampshire, and in first by a lot. So we see this kind of contrast between New Hampshire and the national numbers, and that is going to be, I think, important moving forward. Now, in this mid-October poll, it looks like we have John McCain in second place, Rudolph Giuliani not far behind in third place. Then we see a national poll, an ABC Washington Post poll, and Giuliani again is in the lead in that poll. But we're starting to see Fred Thompson slip at this time, and Thompson is going to be in third place, and McCain is going to move up into second place as we start to get later in the year. And we see a similar thing in this Fox News poll, although it's a little bit closer there between McCain and Thompson, but we still see McCain in second place to Thompson being in third place, and we see Giuliani still in first place here in November. we're getting kind of close to the first voting, and Giuliani is still in first. But then we see below that, we see an ABC Washington Post poll, and that is going to be in Iowa. And we're actually seeing Romney ahead in Iowa, but Huckabee not too far behind. We're seeing Huckabee gaining traction, doing better than he had in earlier polls. And then we see in the last poll there, November 20th, a Rasmussen poll, and that's going to show in South Carolina a tie between Thompson and Romney. So we see a lot of moving parts here. Each of these early states are showing different candidates' strength, and then that is also juxtaposed against the national trends. And we're seeing a really interesting dynamic with these polls. So Huckabee's momentum is going to really start to pick up as we move later in the year. He's going to benefit from some positive media. He's going to appear on numerous TV shows, including some comedy shows. At this point in time, the Daily Show and the Colbert Report are going to be very popular, and he's going to appear on those. And he's going to do well in his television appearances. He's very good on TV. Like I said, he's got a good sense of humor and a sharp wit, and that's going to serve him well as he gets a lot more airtime on these kinds of shows. His debate performances were also solid, and he was seen as maybe being a more optimistic and less negative candidate than the others were. And he had a decent support among young people, not as much as Ron Paul, but still pretty strong. And then, of course, he would benefit from the endorsement of Chuck Norris, an iconic action hero and martial arts enthusiast. So some of his ads that he would run would show Norris, and they would play upon his comedic chops a little bit by showing some nice ads with Chuck Norris endorsing him, and that's going to further bolster him, as it's not only going to play when he runs the ads, but a lot of the TV stations are going to replay those ads, especially on cable news. An event will happen that will bring foreign policy and national security into the forefront of the discussion. Former Pakistani Prime Minister Benazir Bhutto will be assassinated. She had been ousted from power and living in exile, but she was having thoughts about making a comeback. And her assassination was a big story, especially considering the fact that Pakistan was rather in the news during this time. Osama bin Laden was thought to be in hiding in Pakistan, and there were forces within Pakistan that were helping forces within Afghanistan, basically the forces within Afghanistan that were not allied with the U.S. In fact, the ones that were going against the United States as allies were thought to be, getting financial support from elements within Pakistan. So it was a pretty big story, and perhaps it made people think that they wanted a presidential candidate with more foreign policy and national security experience. Now, McCain is going to start to benefit here, especially in New Hampshire, by winning over some newspaper endorsements. And this is going to be a point in time where newspaper endorsements are still going to matter, at least for the time being. And he's going to get both the Manchester Union Leader and the Boston Globe's endorsement. So that's going to really sort of bolster him. You saw him gaining a little bit of traction, kind of moving into second place here. And now with these newspaper endorsements, he's going to further have a little bit of wind in his tail, and he's going to hopefully do a little bit better after getting these newspaper endorsements. So let's take a look at some more polls here. We're going to start with a New Hampshire poll, a Mason-Dixon poll, and Romney is still going to be in first, and Giuliani in second, McCain in third, Huckabee in fourth. And then we see an Iowa poll. Now, Huckabee is going to surge to the lead here in early December in this Iowa poll. Now, in our last set of polls we looked at, Romney was still in first. Huckabee was a close second behind him, but now Huckabee has moved into first with a rather commanding lead over Romney, who is still going to be in second place. And now we're going to see a national poll here, an ARG poll, and Huckabee is surging in this as well. He's now going to be tied nationally with Giuliani, according to this poll, each of them at 21%. And we're going to see a tie for second McCain is going to be in third with 18%, and then Romney in fourth with 16%. And then moving on to South Carolina, we're going to see Huckabee take the lead in South Carolina as well. He's going to have 24%, and it's going to be Fred Thompson in second place in South Carolina with 17%. Giuliani is going to drop into a tie for third with Romney. So Romney's slipping a bit in both Iowa and South Carolina. Some of these states with a lot more evangelical voters seem to be, moving against Romney and towards other candidates. And finally, we see another New Hampshire poll where Romney is maintaining his lead in New Hampshire, and he's at 34%, with McCain now solidly in second with 27%, and the rest of the candidates much further behind. So Giuliani is going to see all these numbers. He's going to see that he's still got quite a bit of strength nationally, but he does not seem to have a lot of strength in these early states. He's dropping into third, sometimes fourth place in a lot of these early states, but he seems to be well supported nationally. So where's this support coming from? It's coming from these larger big states that are going to be coming a little bit later in the calendar. States like Florida and the Super Tuesday states, including Illinois, California, New York, and New Jersey. That's where Giuliani's support is going to be, and those states are going to be very delegate rich if he can make it to them. So he's going to make the controversial decision to skip the early states and lie low until late January, and then start to really go for that Florida primary that's going to be in late January. He's going to get a lot of flack and scrutiny for that decision, but I would argue that it made some sense. Even though he didn't win with this strategy, there is no saying that he would have won either way. He saw John McCain skip Iowa in 2000 and still go on to win in New Hampshire the next week. So it showed that momentum doesn't always carry from one state to the next, from one week to the next. In 1992, we saw Bill Clinton fail to win any of the first three states. And in fact, of the first 7 states, he only won one of those first 7 states, but he would go on to win the nomination anyway. Now, Clinton had benefited that year from the fact that there were numerous other candidates splitting up those other states and splitting up that support, but it looked like a similar thing might be happening here. It looked like you had Huckebee and Thompson very strong in the South, and you had Romney very strong in certain states, McCain, kind of strong in certain states. So perhaps they all might balance each other out, and if Giuliani were to skip all these early states, maybe no one person would really get that much momentum because they would all split up the votes amongst all these early states. And it looked like the poll showed that that was quite a possibility. Romney was weak nationally but strong in New Hampshire, and McCain had a high-profile embarrassing downsizing in his campaign and might not have had the money to compete nationally. Mike Huckabee was surging, but Giuliani thought that he could beat Huckabee in many of the large delegate states. The social conservatives were a thorn in Giuliani's side, but they also had misgivings about Romney, especially the evangelical voters, and Thompson was losing momentum. He was still potentially strong enough in some states to keep other people from gaining momentum, but he didn't seem to be having much momentum of his own. So Giuliani's decision would save him some resources, let the other candidates beat each other up in the early states, and perhaps not any of them will emerge with too much momentum, and then he can move into late January and then really pounce and win the big states moving forward. Romney, for his part, is going to see his sagging numbers in a lot of these states with a strong evangelical presence, what we might call the Bible Belt states. And both Iowa and South Carolina were kind of a strong evangelical communities. So Romney seemed to have a ceiling with those voters, and it was thought that evangelical voters were squeamish about Mormonism. Romney decided to give a speech called the Faith in America speech. The main point was to say that he had his own faith, and that made him have more in common with other people who had strong faith, even if there were some theological differences between those faiths. So Romney made no apologies for his Mormonism and didn't try to water down his belief in Mormon doctrines. So this would win him even more enthusiasm from Mormon voters who would support him even more strongly after this. Now, would it win him evangelical voters in maybe some of these southern or prairie states? Well, in this primary, it didn't look like it did, but we would see 4 years later a lot of those voters would warm up to him, and he would be a lot stronger in 2012, and perhaps this speech would win him support down the road. As it started to get later in December, Tom Tancredo decided to drop out. His poll numbers and fundraising were down. So what was somewhat surprising was that he ended up endorsing Romney, who was relatively moderate. Remember, Tom Tancredo was a pretty staunch conservative, but he would say that although he was closer ideologically to Duncan Hunter and Fred Thompson, he didn't see either of them gaining much ground. He saw Giuliani as too liberal and McCain and Huckabee too weak on his signature issue of immigration. Romney, he reasoned, had a shot at winning and was the best of the four candidates, and he had a reasonable shot of winning, and so he decided to endorse Romney. Of course, 2008 would be the year of a major economic downturn. I have not talked about it yet because we have mostly been talking about 2007. The economy is going to start feeling some pain towards the end of 2007 and then get worse the next year, becoming a major issue in the general election. But it's not going to be so much of an issue in 2007, but it's going to start to be to some degree towards the end of the year. So we finally get to Iowa Caucus Day and January 3rd, and Mike Huckabee is going to win. He's going to get 34% of the vote, 13 delegates. Romney is going to get second place with 25% of the votes, 10 delegates. Thompson is going to be third with 5 delegates, 13% of the vote. McCain also with 13% and 5 delegates. It's going to look like they're tied. Thompson's going to get slightly more votes than McCain. Ron Paul in 5th place with 10% of the votes, 4 delegates. Giuliani, who had largely decided to skip Iowa, is going to get 3.5% of the vote and 0 delegates. So somebody who had been the front runner, not really doing too well in Iowa, and largely because he had, stopped campaigning there, but he had seemed to be losing support there anyway. And then Duncan Hunter in last place there with 0.5% of the vote. So while Duncan Hunter did have a lot of strong social conservative views, and that was thought to maybe help him in Iowa, it's not going to help him enough as he's going to get less than 1% of the vote there in the caucus. And then we're going to have New Hampshire have its primary on January 8th. We had seen Romney ahead in all the polls that we looked at. Now, there were some polls towards the end that showed McCain surging, and indeed, McCain is going to get first place. So he's going to beat out Romney in New Hampshire, and he's going to get 37% of the vote. So that's not going to be too good for Romney, who is from the neighboring state of Massachusetts. But, Romney is going to still get a solid second place there with 31.5% of the vote. Now, Huckabee, you might not think he would naturally be strong in New Hampshire, but you see, there was a bit of momentum that he got from that Iowa win. So we see him getting third place in New Hampshire with 11% of the vote. So not too shabby, although not strong enough to really win any more than one delegate. And Giuliani is going to get fourth with 8.5%, Ron Paul with 7.5%, Fred Thompson with 1%. Thompson didn't campaign a ton in New Hampshire, but he did have a little bit of a presence. I seem to remember a particular intersection in Keene where there was a very prominently placed Fred Thompson sign that I remember passing several times and just being like, oh, Thompson does have a presence in New Hampshire, but not enough to get more than 1% of the vote. And we see Duncan Hunter again getting 0.5% of the vote. So in Iowa, you might be able to excuse that because of the weird caucus system where with each precinct, if you get less than 15%, you're eliminated. But that isn't the case in New Hampshire. So the 0.5% is the actual vote total that he will end up getting. So we're going to see a lot of influencers weigh in at this point. And I'm going to distinguish between earlier when we looked at some of the socially conservative, evangelical folks that were part of Focus on the Family and the Family Research Council. The candidate that they really wanted to stop with Giuliani was Giuliani, as they saw him as too socially liberal. Now, these folks here are going to be a little bit more secular and going to have a little bit different priorities. They were largely okay with Giuliani, especially Sean Hannity. He was, at least a sort of lukewarm supporter of Giuliani. He liked the job he was doing as mayor. He was a fellow New Yorker. But as Giuliani is going to start start to lose momentum here, a lot of them are just going to shift towards Mitt Romney. They're going to see, like Tom Tancredo, they're also very concerned about immigration, and the candidate that they really want to stop is John McCain. So after John McCain won in New Hampshire, they see him becoming a much more viable candidate. He didn't seem so viable earlier, but now with this New Hampshire win, he is going to be viable, and they're going to want to stop McCain, and they see Romney as their best shot at doing so. So we're going to see Rush Limbaugh, we're going to see Ann Coulter, we're going to see Laura Ingraham and Sean Hannity start to rally around Mitt Romney at this time. So the Michigan primary would be next, and we haven't talked as much about Michigan, but it was a state that John McCain carried in 2000, and he hoped to be able to do well there as well. But Romney also had a tie to Michigan. Remember, his father had been governor of Michigan, so the two both thought that they had a good shot at winning there. Now, a question would come up about the economy, and we're starting to see the national economy start to go down, but the Michigan economy is going to be particularly bad, not only during this period, but it had been bad throughout a lot of the late 20th and early 21st century. So the question is going to be asked about the manufacturing jobs that had been lost. And McCain, trying to have a sort of straight talk moment where he wants to be seen as candid and honest, he's going to say those jobs aren't coming back. And, people are going to be offended by that and feel like he was too pessimistic. Romney is going to say, oh, what do you mean? Of course, the jobs will come back. So that's going to really seem to hurt McCain, at the end of the day, and it's going to seem to help Romney. So as we look at the numbers here at the Michigan primary on January 15th, now Michigan had been penalized for going too early. Normally Michigan would have a lot more delegates than this, being a fairly large state, but they lost half their delegates because they decided to go so early. But we see Mitt Romney winning the state that his father had governed a generation ago, and we see John McCain coming in second. Again, Huckabee, not too shabby here in this northern state. Michigan is far from Arkansas, but it did have a little bit of evangelical voters, some social conservatives, and Huckabee certainly won over many of those with his 16% of the vote, so he'll get 3 delegates there. And Ron Paul will be in 4th, Fred Thompson in 5th, and Giuliani in 6th. Several days later, we'll have the Nevada caucus on January 19th. Nevada is going to be a state with a pretty large Mormon population, and they're all going to come out in droves and support Mitt Romney. It's going to be his strongest showing yet. And really, I don't think any candidate in any of the states we've seen so far has gotten more than 50% of the vote, but Romney here is going to get 51% of these caucus votes in Nevada and get 17 of the delegates. Second place in Nevada is going to be Ron Paul, and this is a state where there's a fairly large libertarian presence. Remember, it's a state where gambling is legal in much of the state, and there's a libertarian streak there, and so Ron Paul was able to appeal to his share of voters there and get second place. McCain would get third, Huckabee 4th, tied with Thompson, and then Giuliani is going to be in 6th place in Nevada. On the same day, South Carolina will also hold its primary, and that's going to be very competitive because it's a Bible Belt state, a lot of evangelical voters, and that's Huckabee's strength. But there's also a strong military and veteran presence in South Carolina, so that is McCain's strength. Now, in the earlier polls that we looked at, McCain really wasn't that strong, but his win in New Hampshire is going to give him a fair amount of momentum, and he's going to end up eking out a victory here in South Carolina, just beating out Huckabee. Now, we had seen a national poll earlier with Huckabee in the lead. We see him maybe overperforming slightly in some northern states, so you might have thought that he would be the odds-on favorite to win in South Carolina, but maybe he's starting to lose a little momentum here, or maybe it's just McCain gaining the momentum, but he wins it narrowly and gets first place. We see Fred Thompson, another Southerner, and hoping to do well in South Carolina, Carolina, but he's really going to end up only getting 15.5%, which the way they divvied up the delegates in South Carolina, that's not going to earn him any. And Romney is going to be a little bit behind him in fourth place. Again, Romney not performing so well in this more socially conservative, more evangelical tilted state. And then Giuliani behind him and Ron Paul as well. So Fred Thompson is going to drop out after that disappointing showing in South Carolina, and we're going to move on to Florida. And this was the state where Giuliani really hoped to win. It was what he was all betting on, hoping that by laying low for those early states that it would help him to pounce in Florida. But McCain had managed to win that momentum. He first won New Hampshire, and then his maybe a bit of an upset win in South Carolina gave him a lot of momentum. And Florida is also a state with a lot of veterans, and they seem to be strongly behind McCain. So he's going to end up winning first place, and this will be a winner take all. So McCain is going to win all of the delegates, and we're going to see Romney coming in a fairly respectable second, but not able to muster any delegates because of the way Florida divvied it up. And again, Giuliani with a disappointing third place. Huckabee, maybe he's starting to lose momentum because Florida does have its share of evangelicals. It is a southern state, but Huckabee is only able to muster fourth place, Ron Paul fifth place. So after this Florida primary, we're going to see Giuliani drop out as he's going to see no pathway forward. And then we're going to see the Maine caucus on February 3rd. Romney is going to win there. He's going to get more than 50% of the vote. Maine, a New England state. Romney had represented Massachusetts. McCain is going to get second. Now, McCain is fairly popular in New England, but Maine is going to be a state where he doesn't do as well in. He didn't win in 2000 either. I think it was the only state he didn't win in 2000, and he's not going to win it here in 2008. He's going to get a distant second. Ron Paul is going to get third place, and then Huckabee further behind with only 6% of the vote. And then we're going to get Super Tuesday. So there's going to be a lot of states going Super Tuesday. So I'm not going to be able to give as much detail about each one, but I thought maybe we would break it down into three different slides here. So we're just going alphabetically. So we have Huckabee winning in Alabama, and Alabama, like South Carolina in some ways, a lot of evangelical voters, but Huckabee is able to narrowly beat McCain in Alabama, whereas McCain had narrowly beaten Huckabee in South Carolina. But we're going to see in Alaska, Mitt Romney winning there, getting a rather solid win there with Huckabee in second place. Then in Arizona, John McCain's home state, he's going to get less than 50% of the vote. There's going to be a fair amount of Mormons in Arizona that are going to show up for Romney. Not enough to give Romney the victory, but to give him a fairly respectable second place there. And then Huckabee's home state of Arkansas, Huckabee is going to do much better there, getting more than 60% of the vote. McCain a more distant second in Huckabee's home state. McCain's only going to get 20% of the vote. But California is going to be fairly close, a very delegate-rich state, but we're going to see McCain showing some strength there. His momentum is going to carry him to a win in the Golden State over Romney, who's going to get second place. And then in Colorado, now Romney is going to have a much more decisive win in Colorado, another state with a fairly large Mormon presence. So any states with a large percentage of Mormons, it seems like Romney's going to really clean up in those states, and he gets 60% of the vote over McCain's 18%. So Romney's margin in Colorado is going to be bigger than McCain's margin in his home state of Arizona. So maybe the pattern that we're seeing is that in southern states, it's a battle between McCain and Huckabee, with sometimes McCain winning, sometimes Huckabee not. But McCain is fairly strong in the South. Romney is not strong in the South. We're not seeing him getting even second place in any southern states. But as we move outside of the South, it varies. I think some of the smaller states seem to be won more often than not by Romney, but the larger states seem to be going with McCain. It seems like like Romney seems to be stronger in the West and McCain a little bit stronger in the East. And that might be a little surprising since McCain was a Westerner. He was from Arizona, but a lot of those Western states with the strong Mormon presence and also those smaller Western states with Romney's strong organization, I think he was helped by both of those factors, whereas McCain seemed to click with a lot of New England voters and a lot of voters in states like Delaware, for example, and we see Connecticut here, another New England state. It's neighboring to Romney's Massachusetts, but nevertheless, McCain with a decisive first place win here with 52% to Romney's 33. In Delaware here, McCain winning over Romney by a similar margin. Georgia, though a southern state, and we see again Huckabee and McCain very close. This time Huckabee with a narrow victory over McCain in Georgia, but both of them are pretty close. Then we see Illinois, a state that Giuliani had hoped to win, but I think a lot of those Giuliani voters kind of shifted towards McCain as we see him getting an 18-point win in Illinois. Now Romney will win his home state of Massachusetts, 51% to McCain's 41%. So not too shabby by McCain in Romney's home state there, getting 41% of the vote. Now Minnesota is a state that is in the sort of Midwest, a kind of prairie state. I don't think there's a large Mormon presence there, but Romney is able to win. Perhaps it's a smaller state. I believe it was a caucus, and I think we'll see Romney doing a lot better with caucuses. So he's going to win a 19-point win in Minnesota. Now Missouri, it's sort of a middle state. It's partly southern, partly Midwestern. We're going to see McCain very narrowly eke out a win there over Huckabee, 33% to 32%. Montana, another Western state, Romney's going to win. Ron Paul is actually going to get second in Montana. So it's a little bit similar to Nevada there with Montana, a very rugged, individualistic kind of state. And it's right in Ron Paul's wheelhouse as he's going to get second place with 25%. But Romney is going to be stronger. I think that there is a pretty big Mormon presence in Montana. So New Jersey, another eastern state, McCain is going to win there pretty strongly, pretty solidly. Same thing with New York. And both New York and New Jersey, a lot of delegates there, pretty big states. But North Dakota, another smaller state, we're going to see Romney perform stronger there. So it's a prairie state, and we saw Huckabee doing well in prairie states. But North Dakota doesn't have as many evangelicals. It's a little bit more Lutheran there. A lot of folks who were of Scandinavian and German extraction, as opposed to what you might find in a state like Kansas or Iowa. So we would see Oklahoma, McCain winning there, but only narrowly. Huckabee also with a very strong showing in Oklahoma. Tennessee, though, you would see Huckabee with a slight win over McCain. Now, Utah is going to have the most decisive result. Of course, Utah is the heart of Mormon country, and Romney is going to get 89% of the vote. So that's about as strong of a percentage as anybody is going to get anywhere. So we see here Romney is going to get his share of states won. Huckabee's going to get his share of states won, but the larger states with the more delegates are going to go with McCain. And by the end of this Super Tuesday, despite the fact that Romney did pretty decently in many states around the country, it's gonna seem as though McCain is going to become the de facto nominee, and we're going to see Romney drop out right after the Super Tuesday. So Romney is going to end his campaign despite showing a fair amount of strength there, and McCain it's gonna be his to lose now. Huckabee is going to still continue to soldier on and try to move forward and compete in the remaining states, but it doesn't look like Huckabee's got much of a chance. But it seems as though he just wants to run his campaign, let the voters in those other states vote. So on February 9th, we're going to see Huckabee do pretty decently. He's going to win decisively in Kansas. So that's going to be a prairie state where there is going to be a pretty strong evangelical presence, and he's going to get a decisive win there. And Huckabee is also going to get a win in Louisiana. So another southern state, a border state to his home state of Arkansas. But we're going to see in the Washington caucus, very close there, McCain 26, Huckabee 24, Paul 22. So three candidates very close to each other, but McCain eking out a narrow win in the Washington caucus. Now Huckabee is going to make Texas, his last stand, his last hurrah, a big state, a southern state. He's going to hope to win there, but he is not going to win. So we're going to see Texas end up going with McCain, despite Huckabee's efforts. Make that his last stand. McCain is going to end up winning. He's also going to win in Maryland, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Wisconsin, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Ohio. So McCain is going to end up winning the nomination and become the de facto nominee. And actually, the Democrats, which we'll get to in the next episode, they are actually not going to be finished here on March 4th. They're going to continue on and have another couple months worth of primaries. So McCain is going to watch the Democrats still competing with each other as he ends up wrapping things up here after March 4th. So stay tuned to that next episode. If you like this, hit the like button and tune in again next time.